So hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining this webinar. Just to make sure that you are in the right place, this is a webinar about tracking forced labor, accidents at work, and climate impacts in mineral and fossil supply chains, with a specific focus on EU's consumption globally. So I'm still seeing participants entering the room, but we're a critical mass already of about 50 in the room and growing. So I think we'll get started. So a few quick words about the study itself. The study was prepared by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, the SDSN, and the University of Sydney in cooperation with the German government. This is part of SDSN's broader program of work on measuring international spillovers in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. The study builds extensively on data and reports from the International Labour Organization. So we're actually very pleased today to have with us Anoucheh Carval, the French government representative to the ILO governing body, who will react to some of the initial interventions that the authors will make today. I'll mention that there should be time at the end of the interventions for Q&A, questions and answers. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section, the Q&A chat, and my colleagues will flag them to me. A quick word about the study itself. So we've heard a lot over the past couple of weeks in the context of the Football World Cup about human rights and environmental abuses in specific parts of the world, and in particular in the construction sector. What this study looks at is at fossil and mineral supply chains and the impact that EU's consumption of fossil and mineral raw material and products is having every year, not every 4 years, but every year on the rest of the world. In terms of social indicators like forced labor and accidents at work, but also environmental impacts such as greenhouse gas emissions. And the main takeaway, and we'll walk you through the results today, but is that those impacts embodied into EU's consumption are significant, and that we see no signs of actual structural improvements according to the latest data available. Obviously, this is something important to consider in the context of the European Green Deal and this goal of the twin green and digital transition, which, in the own words of the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, this twin green and digital transition will be fueled by raw materials. And so the study is published a few days after the end of COP27, a few days after the end of the G20, as well, and it really emphasizes, and also a few months ahead of a big heads of state summit on the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the study really emphasizes the role that the EU and rich countries can play to support, on one hand, of course, decarbonization pathways and mitigation, including in developing countries, but also to work on some of the drivers of forced labor and accidents at work, which include extreme poverty, climate disaster, but also access to social protection as well. And in this context, I think the call made by the UN Secretary General last September at the UN General Assembly for an SDG stimulus is really an important tool to move forward on some of those drivers of forced labor and accidents at work. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Nina Houan to make some introductory remarks. Nina is head of project in the Division for Global Policy in the German government at GIZ. So Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Guillaume, and thank you, the whole of SDSN and your team for organizing this launch event. And thanks also to the University of Sydney and Arunina Malik for the great cooperation we have. The report on tracking forced labor accidents at work and climate impacts on EU consumption of fossil and mineral raw materials is the fourth spillover brief already that we have published together. And for almost 10 years now, SDSN in Germany, on behalf of the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ, we work together to contribute to sustainable development globally. The concept of sustainable development expressed through the 2030 Agenda and the 14 Sustainable Development Goals is the guiding framework for German's government work on development policies. And the overarching goal of the 2030 Agenda is to create a better and more equal and sustainable future for everyone on this planet. And as such, this is only possible through international cooperation and a mutual sense of responsibility. Today, we are deep diving into a topic that is essential when we discuss global responsibility. These are the international spillover effects. Within the last years, research on international spillovers has become increasingly important, and it's an effective tool for the measurement and monitoring of responsibility and cooperation between states. And this is why, in the past years, German politics has increasingly taken spillovers into account, and they continue to do so. SDG monitoring generally looks good for countries in the global north, and as they are passing many difficult problems onto countries of the global south. And this aspect is not a small statistical detail, but a weak point, and does not always reflect reality since essential information is missing. Fortunately, and thanks to the impressive work and cooperation with SDSN, there is the powerful tool of spillover analysis. And by analyzing economic demand and consumption in the global north, spillover analysis can give us a much clearer picture of reality when using it to complement conventional SDG ratings. Often focusing on environmental and socioeconomic processes, such scientific research can help us to outline the direct impacts of state actions on other countries. Only if negative spillovers across countries are being monitored and managed carefully and in all of their dimensions, the visionary promise of the 2030 Agenda can be fulfilled. With that in mind, I would like to once again thank you, SDSN and the University of Sydney, for your work. And I look forward to this online event as one more example of a good cooperation. And to all the participants of this event, I want to wish you an inspiring new insights into this fascinating field of research and a good discussion afterwards. So with these words.
Thank you very much, Nina, and also let me say that we're very grateful at SDSN, of course, for the support that the German government has been providing over the past couple of years to move forward on this agenda, including putting actual measures, indicators, metrics around those issues. So we'll move to the second part of this event, and we'll actually walk you through the actual results of these studies. So my colleagues will be sharing slides in a second. And so, as I mentioned, the study really focuses on EU's impacts embodied into consumption of fossil and mineral supply chains, and in particular, looks at impacts in terms of forced labor, accidents at work, and climate impacts. So just to share a few words about the overall context for this for the study, we are known at SDSN for tracking every year the performance of all UN member states on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. That's actually the next slide. So we do those series of assessments, the Sustainable Development Reports, which include an SDG index and dashboards. And as part of this analysis, this ranking, those scoring, we include impacts embodied notably into trade, so-called spillover effects, right? So those spillover effects can be generated, for instance, by outsourcing key emitting sectors like cement or steel to other countries and re-importing the production. And we have the tool now to actually track those impacts that are embodied into trade. Next slide. And so what those series of assessments have shown, and here you have the results of two flagship assessments done by the SDSN, both from the SDG Index, but also the World Happiness Report, which is also prepared annually by the SDSN with many partners. We see that European countries tend to be in the lead. And in the case of the SDGs, this is really driven by relatively better performance overall when it comes to the sustainable development goals that are more socio-economic. So, you know, SDG 1 to 10, but also SDG 16 on strong institutions. Having said that, when we isolate the impacts from consumption, so those international spillovers, and we put it in terms of an international spillovers index, we see that those countries are actually among the worst performers globally when it comes to those impact generated notably through trade and consumption. So it means that, you know, despite the overall good performance of some of those rankings, there is still work to do to curb those negative spillover effects. The next slide, please. And another way to look at it is actually if we take the average of the EU 27, or we can also look at the OECD member states as well, we see that on average they perform better when we look at all the 17 sustainable development goals. But again, when we isolate only their average on international spillovers, they are the worst performers compared with the rest of the world. Next slide, please. And this is actually increasingly being recognized also, including by European leadership. So here is just a quote or a citation from the resolution on the SDGs adopted by the European Parliament, which basically stresses the fact that SDG policies in the EU and EU internal policies not only contribute to the implementation of the SDGs, but also have a very high ecological, social, and economic spillover impact on developing countries and vulnerable groups and populations. There's actually been a call by the European Parliament made to the European Commission to prepare a communication on this issue around policy coherence for sustainable development and spillover impacts before the end of the mandate of this Commission. Next slide, please. And to follow up on what Nina was saying previously, this study published today focused on a specific supply chain in the EU is part of a broader set of work that DSDSN, working with many partners, including the University of Sydney, has been doing over the years to incorporate this discussion and those data and metrics into the larger conversation, policies, and investments around the sustainable development goals. So you see here just a snapshot of some of the work that we've been doing. We've been working closely with the European Parliament, but also with the European Commission via Eurostat in trying to incorporate those metrics into SDG reporting. And we also, you know, in 2022, we are here today launching this specific studies, but there will also be next week the publication of our Global Common Stewardship Index, which looks at countries' domestic and spillover impacts on the rest of the world. This is a global assessment. And also we're launching later in December our flagship Europe Sustainable Development Report, which also has a strong emphasis on this issue. Moving on to the results of the study today, and I'll hand it over to Arunima to really go into the details. But I think what's quite interesting is, you know, just to put a few metrics and a few numbers around those issues. So when we look across all sectors, we estimate that in terms of consumption, the EU basically generates around 1.2 million cases of forced labor, more than 4,000 cases of accidents at work, and 4.7 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions. And when we isolate the part of that consumption which comes from the rest of the world, so the international part, the import dimension, we see that those numbers remain very significant. When we look at forced labor, this is 40% of those impacts that are generated abroad, and the same for greenhouse gas emissions. But the other thing to note is that's an average across all sectors. If we look specifically at the supply chains around fossil and mineral raw material and products, then the impacts that are generated abroad actually represent the vast majority. The share of those impacts is the vast majority are generated abroad. Actually, more than 75% of modern slavery cases, accidents at work, and emissions embodied into those supply chains are generated outside of the EU's borders. So the international dimension is extremely important. I'll stop here, and now I'll hand it over to Arunima walk you through the actual, in detail, the actual method and the key findings of the study. Aurima, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you also to UNSTS and GIZ for really recognizing the importance of putting numbers to these spillover impacts and really supporting this study that we are presenting here today. Next slide, please. So I'll walk us through the process we followed in terms of the methodology applied for quantifying spillover impacts of fossil and mineral raw material supply chains. And when we talk about supply chains, we need to look at the individual links that happen upstream and the hotspots that happen upstream in sort of satisfying EU's final demand. So here I have a simplistic diagram of a supply chain tree, as I call it, starting at the bottom with EU highlighted in the map. So we are considering EU's final demand for a range of products, be it agricultural products, demand for electricity, for fuel, for construction materials, buildings as they are being built, textiles, retail, wholesale, different activities that take place within the EU for satisfying demand for consumers are in turn linked with some way, shape, or form in the upstream mineral supply chains. So minerals really form the foundation, and so do fossil fuels of many of the activities that happen around our economy, which are ultimately required for satisfying consumption. And that is what we tackled in this report on fossil and mineral raw materials. So we have EU's final demand. We considered domestic impacts, so production that is happening within the EU states for producing either fossil and mineral raw materials, or EU's demand overseas in terms of spillover impacts or the imports into EU for satisfying final demand. Next slide, please. So, sorry, if we can just go back with the red dots. So these red dots that I have here demonstrate the way that we've considered mineral and fossil raw materials is not just immediate consumption in terms of consumption of fossil and raw materials by the EU, but fossil and raw materials that are embodied in many of the products that the EU consumes. And by embodied, I mean to say that they are hidden away upstream in the supply chain, which might not be visible as if we go to the shop and buy a textile product or a piece of clothing, we might not be aware that actually some of the foundations, if we look deeper in the supply chain, might actually end up in the mining sector somewhere in other countries. So we identified these hotspots of fossil and mineral raw materials and associated impacts at various links in the supply chains. And these red circles that I have on this slide are really illustrative of the fact that we considered not just the direct impacts, but also indirect impacts, and not just indirect impacts at immediate layers of production, but also upstream layers. So layers where you have suppliers or suppliers of suppliers, and it sort of keeps going so that we do not miss any hotspots. Next slide, please. The indicators that we considered for this study, we looked at income, male and female employment, which can be considered as positive spillovers, but we rather call these descriptive indicators because they can be unsafe working practices embodied in jobs or employment. We looked at modern slavery, we looked at accidents at work, and we looked at emissions as an environmental indicator. Ultimately, we linked these to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. The model that we used for putting this quantification or the number to the spillover impacts is this multi-regional input-output database. So multi-regional input-output analysis is a technique which relies on global international trade databases, which capture detail on regions and sectors. So it's a regional and sectoral assessment. For this particular study, we considered 164 regions and 97 sectors in each of those 164 regions. So for fossil and mineral raw materials, we had detail about the various fossil categories. We had detail about a range of mining sectors, for example, uranium, aluminium, copper, gold, and a couple of other sectors in the economy. So this database that we used for quantifying impacts for this study, can we just click once, please? Came from the GLORIA model, which is the Global Resource Input-Output Assessment model. This Global Resource Input-Output Assessment was developed in collaboration with the UNEP, and it's checked and it's fairly robust in the sense that academics and collaborators in UNEP have gone through the process of fact-checking and really going through multiple iterations of putting together a global model that is now used for quantifying spillover impacts in the supply chain. Next slide, please. In terms of key results, as Guillaume mentioned, we started off by looking at all the sectors in the economy and domestic impacts and also impacts embodied in imports. And the totals are really staggering. So we have, of course, if we consider descriptive indicators, we have jobs being created in the supply chain for women and men, income generated in the supply chain, of course, in industries, as these sectors provide livelihoods to many of the people. But they also result in negative spillover impacts. So we have modern slavery cases in the supply chain, 1.2 million cases across all sectors of the economy. We have fatal accidents at work. And these data sets that we've used for putting these numbers come from reputed sources. So modern slavery, for example, our starting point for the data came from International Labor Organization, global estimates of modern slavery, global slavery data from the Walk Free Foundation. So taking this information at a production level and linking it up with the global input-output database, we were able to trace these impacts in the supply chain for satisfying EU's demand for various products. If we isolate the impacts just for imports, we see that the percentages for the social indicators are quite large. So modern slavery, 40% or so of the impacts are embodied in imports coming in to EU, so spillover impacts. We have substantial greenhouse gas emissions embodied in imports as well. If we look at the composition, next slide please, of the domestic and import-based impacts, they vary quite a bit. So taking the 97 sectors that we started off with, for ease of visualization, we aggregated those 97 sectors into 13 or so categories. And after aggregating the 97 sectors into 13 or so categories, we looked at the composition of EU's impacts in terms of domestic, and by domestic, I mean production and consumption happening within EU, and imports, production happening outside of EU, but consumption happening within EU. So if I just select two key examples, so if we look at modern slavery, for example, again, these impacts are across all sectors of the economy. So we started off looking at the economy-wide impacts, all sectors, and then isolated the impacts for fossil and mineral raw materials. So for modern slavery, majority of the impacts take place in either the construction sector or agriculture, fishing, and forestry sectors. Next slide, please. As Guillaume mentioned, if we look at the supply chains for fossil and mineral raw materials, so from the last diagram where we had impacts for all the sectors, if we isolate the supply chains for fossil and mineral raw materials to put a number to the impacts in terms of spillovers, it's really staggering to see that for some of the indicators, majority of the impacts take place abroad. And that is, and I'll pick one indicator, and that is modern slavery. So most of the impacts, as we see here, take place outside of the EU for producing fossil and mineral raw materials that ultimately end up in the EU in the form of raw materials, or are actually processed in the form of manufactured products, which are finally consumed in the EU. Across all indicators, except slightly for income, most of the impacts are really 3/4 if we consider spillovers embodied in supply chains. Next slide, please. We can also look at the impacts by considering the final sectors. So which are the final sectors in the EU economy, which are sort of having a demand in terms of fossil and mineral raw materials. And the key ones that really stand out are services, for example. So for modern slavery, if we take a simple example, if there's a banking sector, that banking sector requires electricity and furnishing, but what is the supply chain of all that furnishing that goes on in offices? So ultimately we need minerals, or we need fossil fuels on raw materials for ensuring that we get to processed products which are used in service sectors. So this technique that we used has sort of been able to link raw materials, production of raw materials, impacts of, happening in those raw material sectors, but then final consumers and these tertiary sectors, which are sort of the final consumers of these raw materials, and the hotspots are happening further up in the supply chain. Next slide, please. When I talk about hotspots, we can see which regions these hotspots are happening in. So if we look at three key indicators: modern slavery, accidents at work, greenhouse gas emissions, most of the impacts take place in the Asia Pacific and for modern slavery and accidents at work. And also for modern slavery, we see impacts taking place in Africa. And this is to do with the production of mineral products, fuel, oil, distillation products, and other raw materials or metals, which are eventually required by many of the industries in the EU. This graph that we see here, it's a production layer decomposition graph, where on the x-axis, you're able to decompose impacts in the supply chain, and on the y-axis, we have the actual absolute impacts for every indicator. Next slide, please. So just quickly, before I pass it back to Guillaume, for the regions that I showed on the last slide for production layer decomposition, we can actually pick out the individual countries where these impacts in terms of modern slavery cases or accidents at work or emissions are taking place. And some of the top countries that popped out in the assessment that we did using the integrated multi-regional input-output database and the physical data that we used are shown on the slide. But again, to emphasize, economies in the Asia Pacific and in Africa are really the ones that sort of have these mining sectors that are producing fossil and mineral raw materials that are either being sent directly. So just to emphasize that these products are either being sent directly to the EU for consumption, or if you remember back to my diagram where I had the circles, the red circles, the products are then sent off to another country, processed, and then sent to the EU. So we've considered both linkages in terms of direct consumption and indirect consumption via other international trade linkages. And I'll pass it back to Guillaume now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahunima, and I'm sure this will lead to many questions afterwards. But just to emphasize maybe a couple of points that you made. So the first one is, the study focuses a lot on negative impacts embodied into EU's consumption. At the same time, we do want to flag in those studies also the fact that trade is a huge provider of employment and income in the rest of the world. So this is not a call for deglobalization. This is a call for cleaning up supply chains, of course. And this is why in all of those studies, we also map out some of those positive impacts in terms of income generated and employment and the importance of trade, including for developing countries. The second thing I wanted to also emphasize is that the methods are now very robust and actually have been published extensively in the literature. So this is quite technical and requires to deep dive, as you've seen, in several layers, upstream supply chains. All of the details are, of course, available online. But I just want to emphasize that both on the quality of the data, but also in terms of the methods, those methods are very solid. Speaking of the data, and I'm sure this is something that Anousheh knows very well, of course, but just to mention that when we talk about forced labor in the study, this excludes actually child labor, but also forced marriage as well. And in general, I would emphasize that these are probably low estimates due to something that the ILO has been documenting also over the years, which is the fact that there's a lot of under-reporting for those types of impacts and indicators. Let me move on very quickly, and I'll accelerate a little bit so that we can move on to our next speaker. But just in terms of the key sort of policy messages that we have in the study, and I think there were still a few slides. So what we present in the study is sort of a 3-pillar framework and a package of policies that could be leveraged and actually mobilized to address those negative spillovers. Let's move on to the next slide already. And so we obviously think that there's a number of EU domestic instruments and regulations that can be mobilized. I think there's a lot of discussions around the due diligence regulation at the EU level. France and Germany already have due diligence regulations to make companies accountable for addressing and reporting those kinds of impacts across supply chains. And so I think the improvements and the discussions at the EU level might lead to some progress in that aspect. There's also discussions around import bans. There's been one adopted for deforestation by the European Parliament in September 2022, discussions around import bans for forced labor, mirroring a little bit the policies adopted in Canada, for instance, or the United States. There's all the conversations around the border adjustment mechanisms for carbon. Now, what we're emphasizing is that those kinds of border adjustment mechanisms, first of all, should make sure that they complied with WTO rules, but also they must be combined with other policies so that we avoid the trap of both hidden protectionism, as it could be perceived by the rest of the world, but also actually worsening the situations in the rest of the world by suddenly banning and reducing actually income and employment in many parts of the world. So it's really a call for how can the EU work with trade partners, cooperate, move forward on multilateralism, the call for scaling up sustainable development finance, which we basically call Green Deal, SDG diplomacy, and financing, which we think is a key role. The financing is important, also the knowledge transfers and the transfers of know-how, including on the fact that the EU and many European countries have very advanced systems for universal healthcare coverage or social protection, for instance. And so that could be part of sort of a Green Deal, SDG diplomacy and financing. And then as a last point, we think that there's also a role, of course, for responsible consumption, recycling, and innovation. And on that last point on innovation, we know that there's been quite a bit of progress, and that has been documented by the International Energy Agency on, for instance, how solar panels now are becoming more and more efficient in terms of the amount of material that they require. And there's also space, of course, for research and development, innovation, which are, of course, things that for a network of scientists and researchers dedicated to sustainable development is something that is obviously an important aspect of the work of the SDSN networks. And I'll close with the last point, which is around sort of the general geopolitical context and the momentum maybe to think about consumption-based impacts and assessments. That's the next slide. There's obviously, a stated objective in the Commission to use trade to export European values, zero tolerance for child labor in EU's trade policy. There's been a number of discussions also at the European Parliament. I mentioned them around import bans. And at the member states level, there's also a growing emphasis on efficiency consumption measures as well. There was a stated objective by the previous Swedish government to also set some sort of consumption-based target. So there seems to be a momentum of policy discussion that might lead to progress in the coming years. Obviously, there's always a gap between the adoption of policies and what the outcome data and statistics can report. But we also think that an initiative like the Global Gateway, for instance, which is the equivalent of for the EU of the Belt and Road Initiative in China or the Build Back Better World in the United States, so those large infrastructure projects, international infrastructure project, could be mobilized to support stronger investments into the human and physical infrastructure needed to achieve the SDGs in the rest of the world, and hence reduced the EU's global footprint in terms of the impacts that we've been looking at. So that's for the summary of the study. We'll go back in the Q&A around specific aspects of the study, but let me hand it over now to Anoucheh Carva, who's the French government representative to the International Labour Organization governing body and to the G7, G20 for labor, employment, and social protection policies. Anoucheh, you're also the chair of Alliance 8.7, and we'd love to hear your views as someone that knows the topic very well on the global priorities when it comes to data and policies to improve workers' conditions and address forced labor in supply chains. Anoucheh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, very well. Absolutely.
Okay. First and foremost, I'd like to commend STSN, but also the University of Sydney, GIZ and BMAS for this very insightful report. It is a great pleasure to me to be with you today as a French representative to the ILO, and also, as you said, as the chair of Alliance 8.7. And with great pleasure, I will address the three questions you sent me: the reality and prevalence of forced labor all over the world, the challenges in collecting data, as you said, for the latest global estimates on modern slavery, and the solutions put forward by the Alliance 8.7, its pathfinder countries, and France as a pathfinder country also in this realm. So what does the concept of modern slavery cover, and how can we frame it globally today? For the UN system, as you said, modern slavery includes both forced labor and forced marriages. Forced labor covers situations in which people are forced to work in degrading conditions, which consist of withholding their wages by abusive employers to compel them to stay in a job. This is the most common form of coercion, followed by the abuse of vulnerability through threats of dismissal, but also more severe forms such as forced confinement, physical and sexual violence. The ILO global estimates developed with the Australian NGO Walk Free Foundation and the International Organization for Migrations shows that on any given day in 2021, there are nearly 27.6 million men, women, and children worldwide who are forced to work against their will and under threat. The comparison with 2016 estimates indicates an increase of 2.7 million of victims between 2016 and 2021. And as you said it, Guillaume, all these data are underestimated. This increase is driven entirely by the private economy, both in forced commercial sexual exploitation, which is 23% of the total, and in forced labor in other sectors, touching all parts of private economy, mainly in services, as you said, Arunima, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, and domestic working, in lesser extent in mine digging or in forced labor abroad, fishing, fishing vessels. No region of the world is spared from forced labor, and forced labor is a concern regardless of a country's wealth. We must keep in mind that this increase takes only partially into consideration the COVID-19 long-lasting economic and social effects, as well as the coming food and energy shortages due to the aggression war of Russia against Ukraine. 3.9 million people are also said to be subjected to forced labor imposed by public authorities. This last case covers requisition of individuals for the performance of public works, compulsory prison labor, the abuse of conscription, etc., etc. These forms of forced labor are also imposed in some cases, as you know, as a measure of political coercion, discrimination, or as a sanction for the expression of political opinions. IOM, ILO Walk Free estimates show that forced labor is not an issue solely in developing countries. Profits from the forced labor industry are higher in the European Union and other developed countries than they are anywhere elsewhere in the world. According to the ILO's 2014 calculation, victims of forced labor around the world generate approximately $150 billion a year in illicit profits. Forced labor thrives, as you said, Guillaume, in the incubator of poverty and vulnerability, low levels of education and literacy, migration, and other factors of high risk, such as armed conflicts. So you asked me about the challenges the ILO and the IOM faced while collecting data for the global estimates. The estimates of forced labor in the private economy are derived from nationally representative household surveys in only 68 countries for the moment, using a common set of questions on forced labor for 78,000 respondents, which is, as you said, because of the small number of countries involved, underestimated. The survey started in 2017, but the modalities of data collection were much affected by the emergence of COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 2021. For these reasons, the national sets of data are not considered robust enough to provide disaggregated information at the national level. Furthermore, household surveys cannot be used for ethical reasons, as you may imagine, for collecting data about forced child labor under 15 and sexual exploitation. Regarding state-imposed forced labor, IOM and ILO built estimates for each of its three main categories, i.e. compulsory prison labor, abuse of conscription, and compulsory labor for the purpose of economic development. As you can imagine, also household surveys could not obviously be used in this realm. Cases of forced labor were therefore identified through a systematic review of the comments of the ILO supervisory bodies, followed by a review of secondary sources. Since their publication, these estimates are put under question by countries that were named, such as Belarus or China. And as you know, China refutes these type of estimates because they think that at the end of the day, it is hidden protectionism. So in which ways the Alliance 8.7 is helpful in detecting and eliminating forced labor? This was your third question. Alliance 8.7 is a unique partnership in the United Nations environment, which brings together all the stakeholders who want to accelerate their efforts to achieve target 8.7 of the SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth. Being part of this initiative involves taking immediate and effective measures to end child labor in all its forms by 2025 and eradicate forced labor, human trafficking, and modern-day slavery by 2030. By bringing together all the stakeholders involved, Alliance 8.7 aims to strengthen engagement and coordination at the global level, but also the adoption of concrete solutions and measures in a limited number of so-called pathfinder countries. The pathfinder countries are committed to adopting a national whole of government and multi-annual acceleration strategy in consultation with social partners, businesses, and civil society stakeholders. They commit to report on the implementation of the roadmap on an annual basis. Today, the Alliance gathers more than 400 partners, including countries, international organizations such as ILO, OECD, UNODC, UNICEF, IOM, FAO, civil society organizations, labor unions and employers organizations, but also academia and business networks such as the UN Global Compact, the ILO Global Business Network for Forced Labor, and the Child Labor Platform. At the time I became chair, Alliance 8.7 had 15 pathfinder countries, mainly developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Almost all of them were countries with a high prevalence of forced labor and child labor. This number has grown since to 30, extending the scope to developed countries such as the Netherlands, France, and soon Germany. As chair of the Alliance, I propose to consider achieving target 8.7 as a shared responsibility of all countries, especially all along global supply chains, regardless of the prevalence of these phenomena in their immediate environment. So by joining our forces, our principal endeavor consists of in developing concrete solutions in our 30 Pathfinder countries, underpinned by international cooperation and social dialogue. We believe we can only win the battle if we implement policies closely on the situation in the field and real concerns. For that, we need a broad-based approach, because evidence gathered in the report produced in 2019 by the Alliance 8.7 on global supply chains shows that forced labor and human trafficking, for example, can be traced to the interplay of three critical dimensions. First, gaps in statutory legislation, enforcement and access to justice that create a space for non-compliance. Second, the socio-economic pressures facing individuals and workers. And third, business and trade conduct and environment. For the first one, first and foremost, we should reinforce the rule of law. Forced labor, slavery, and human trafficking are serious crimes and need to be dealt with as such. The responsibility of states to protect workers within their territory or jurisdiction is key. An adequate legal architecture is a critical precondition for effective administration of criminal and labor justice. And yet, important gaps in this regard remain in many countries. According to a recent ILO review, a total of 135 countries have laws that define, criminalize, and assign penalties for forced labor. But in the remaining countries, the issue of forced labor is covered only partially or not at all. In many of these countries where law ostensibly exists, they have not kept pace with recent mutations of forced labor linked to trafficking, recruitment deaths, and other criminal development. So a strong emphasis should be put on law enforcement, survivors protection, and remedies. And again, national studies and comments from the ILO Committee of Experts point a vast discrepancy between estimates of total prevalence and numbers of convictions. Second, a special attention should be paid to addressing socio-economic root causes of forced labor. Poverty, informality, lack of social safety nets, and labor protection, presence of violence, certain social norms, gender, and other forms of discrimination all operate together to limit options for survival and sustainable livelihoods. We should therefore collectively address these root causes. This is what we do in Pathfinder countries by providing adequate living wages and universal access to social protection to those populations in need. And of course, state fragility and armed conflicts are other additional vulnerabilities to forced labor. Such pressures also contribute to people's decision to migrate in search of better opportunity, and migratory journeys can themselves exacerbate vulnerability to forced labor and human trafficking. And three, last but not least, due diligence and decent work in business and trade operations should be promoted by governments from both sides of supply and demand, as you showed it in your report, with the essential contribution of social partners and civil society. As a Pathfinder country of the Alliance 8.7, the government of France, as you said, has developed, with the help of social partners, NGOs, and business networks, a set of actions consistent with our national regulation framework. You mentioned the 2017 due diligence law that creates the obligation for large multinational companies established in France to carry out, publish, and implement a diligence plan, and also prevention plans for the serious violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, human health and safety, which was the other issue in your report, and the environmental spillovers, again, to bar them through these prevention plans. At the EU level, the French national strategy promotes the adoption of a quality legislative instrument for a European due diligence, and this should be done by establishing clearly defined obligations to fight against child and forced labor in the global supply chains of European companies, but also those of companies from non-member countries that bring products and or services in the European single market. The French national strategy also advocates for incorporating strict social clauses in European trade and investment policies. And this could be done by reinforcing the social clauses of the Sustainable Development chapter of trade and investment agreements, with the introduction of performance obligations for the ratification of core ILO standards, including those concerning the prohibition of child and forced labor, with a timetable for ratification where appropriate. These are, in a nutshell, what I could say about some of the policies we are pursuing now in order to fight against forced labor and child labor all along global supply chains in the European single market, in France, but also all over the world, as you know that these global supply chains are now spreading all over the world. And as your report showed, mostly in Asia and Africa, we have some concerns about forced labor and child labor. Thank you very much.
Anousheh, thank you so much for sharing the impressive work of the Alliance 8.7 and the transformative pathways. Thanks also for insisting on the root causes aspect, which is something also that the study emphasizes quite a bit, that some of the degradation in terms of modern slavery might be actually linked to a degradation in or towards the achievement of other SDGs, including education outcomes, extreme poverty, safety nets, but also the fact that climate disasters might also lead to a worsening of workers' condition and to the need to accept actually lower labor standards and working conditions. And I think, what you mentioned around the data and the limitations that the ILO faces in collecting and presenting this data are obviously the same in the study that we published today, because we rely on the data of the ILO. And so all these limitations and caveats are obviously very much relevant in the context of our study. So it's great to see that we're still close to about 100 people interested in this topic. We have some questions in the chat. We also have some questions that I've received by email. I'll let our participants and audience know that I think we'll probably end this webinar probably 5 minutes late, but close to on time. So I think I'll try to ask maybe one question to you, Arunima, and one also to you, Anousheh, based on the various channels through which I received the questions, and I'll answer specifically maybe the questions around the EU and how SDSN works with the EU teams on policy coherence. So maybe starting with you, Arunima, I've received a few questions around sort of the scope of what is being covered in the study. The scope in terms of, how do we basically define fossil and mineral sectors? So what's covered exactly within that? What exactly do we use in terms of our definition of modern slavery, forced labor, but also in terms of the period that is being covered by the study? So that's about the scope. There was also another question, and if you could say a quick word about this as well. We emphasize the impacts on Asia and also Africa. Obviously, lately, there's been a lot of discussions around human rights abuses in the Middle East and some of the Gulf states. So how come those are not so much reflected in the study? What's the explanation? And so let's start with this, and then I'll move to a question to you also, Anousheh.
Yeah. So thanks, Guillaume, and thanks for the question. So in terms of what is covered, fossil and mineral raw materials, that is how we've defined these select sectors that we've sort of selected, and then seen how these feature either directly in EU supply chains or indirectly. So we've looked at coal, a range of fossil materials, lignite, peat. For the minerals, we've looked at uranium, aluminium. So in one of my slides, I had a list of the sectors that we included. So a range of minerals, a range of fossil fuel sectors. So that is what we've considered. In terms of what modern slavery indicator covers, we've looked at forced labor only as part of our study. We have not covered child labor or forced marriages. As I mentioned, the data comes from a range of sources. So Walk Free Foundation, ILO's global estimates of modern slavery. We've looked at 2018 as to illustrate simply because of the availability of data, and also the MRIO tables that we have. MRIO data for 2018 is robust, hence we took that as our starting point for this assessment. If you'll check the report, we also have presented time series information for some of the indicators to see how things have progressed over time. And in fact, we've noticed that they haven't really. So of course, efforts need to be made in sort of addressing that, as Guillaume mentioned. Quickly on the Gulf states, a part of the reason is to do with missing information when investigating why Gulf states are not showing the kind of proportion that one might expect it to be. And Anousheh went through a range of limitations, which are also part of the study in terms of underreporting of estimates. But just broadly, if we look at the proportions, just for mining sectors, it would be a single-digit number in terms of currently, as we are observing for Gulf states. But two caveats: they're underreported currently, and we can of course run the model to look at it from a comprehensive supply chain perspective in terms of other sectors. But just for mining, single-digit number at this point.
Great, thank you so much, Arunima. And on the questions around the scope and so on, there's a lot of detail in the study itself. And of course, if there's further questions after the webinar, Arunima and myself will be obviously happy to clarify any of those. Anousheh, so you know, what the study does is basically to call also the EU and see what the EU can do in order to improve that situation. And I'm just wondering, besides obviously the moral argument to curb those impacts in terms of forced labor and accidents at work, is there also, you know, an economic argument that you know, we should push for, both in terms maybe of increased tax revenues, health status, productivity of workers? I'm just wondering whether there's, besides the moral call for this, whether there's also an economic point. And then a quick side question as well. You mentioned that obviously due to the time lags and statistics and so on, it's still difficult to have a comprehensive understanding of the impact of COVID-19 on workers' conditions and safety and so on. I'm just wondering whether there's some early findings from some of the work that's been done by the ILO or as part of the Alliance 8.7 that might sort of give us a hint of what has been the impact of COVID-19 on workers' condition, globally speaking.
Thank you very much for these two very important questions. Yes, in terms of economic benefits, of course, there is an economic benefit on that, because, you know, mostly forced labor is based on informal economy in source countries. And if we can, fight against informal economy, then we can have social contribution coming into the funds of governments in developing countries that can provide with these funds social protection to their population, and also to put children at school, which is one of the main reasons we are facing difficulties now for fighting against child labor, is how, because these countries would say, well, if these children are not in farms, then they will be in the streets, because we have no educational framework to absorb these children that are not working in the farms. So for all these reasons, there is obviously an economic benefit in source countries. And if the source countries have better conditions, then of course the EU or other, global North countries would benefit from that. But of course, one question, which is not moral at all, is about the procurement policies of North countries, because most people think that if they buy cheap products and cheap articles, it is because they are very clever and they can just go and find it on the market. But the fact is that this search for downsizing the prices is one of the major issues for which these kind of compulsory recruitments in forced labor and the recourse to child labor take place. So for all these reasons, there is an obvious economic benefit on that, because it gives also what we call, and what we are very attached to at the European level, which is a level playing field for everyone, and especially for our companies. So this is a major issue for all of us. This is not hidden protectionism at all, but it is a way of putting forward fair competition for our companies. The second question is about the effects of COVID-19. The fact is that in a year or two, we can also make another global estimate taking into consideration the long-lasting effects of COVID-19. What we know for child labor is that we have already done these projections for child labor, because we have a much higher number of sets of national inquiries, household inquiries and surveys for child labor. And I'm sure that in forced labor, we will make progress also. But anyway, in the case of child labor, we have projections and the situation will worsen. So we know that. We know that the COVID-19 would most probably put another, or has already put another 9 million children, which will be added to the 160 million children right now at work. There will be another 9 million children at work because of the COVID-19. And this is before any other, calculation of the effects of, the Ukrainian war. So for all these reasons, each time we are making progress, in calculating these phenomenon. But anyway, the only thing we should know is that when there is a high prevalence of forced labor in a region, we can make sure that the products from these regions have a part of forced labor entering in their production. So this is something that we cannot deny. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anike. And maybe just a quick point of clarification of this issue of hidden protectionism. This is not obviously what the report is saying, that those import bans or tariffs that might be put at the border would lead to, but this is how it might be perceived in certain parts of the world. And what the study emphasizes is that those import bans, those tariffs, including the border adjustment mechanisms and others, can be part of the solution, but part of a broader package of comprehensive policies to curb those negative spillovers, including this SDG Green Deal diplomacy that can be leveraged with partner countries, with trade partners, financing, knowledge transfer, technology transfers, and so on to clean up those international supply chains. Let me move to a last question, and then we'll need to close because we're already past the hour. There was a question around how do we communicate those results and the findings to the EU leadership. So a couple of points here. First of all, obviously this study has been supported by the German government, who has been very active over the past couple of years in supporting and promoting this work. And again, what we've tried to do over the years is to, first of all, put hard numbers and figures around this, because we think then it's easier to advocate and push for more actions and investments once you have hard figures and numbers around this. We know also that a country like Finland, for instance, and I'm starting at member states level, has including this issue in an entire chapter on negative spillovers in its voluntary national review presented to the United Nations. And that's one example. There are others. We're working closely with the French government these days, which is preparing a voluntary national review for July to be presented at the UN, and see whether this issue around supply chains and spillovers might be incorporated in there. Besides what's going on at member states level, we know also that this work and our past studies have been very much leveraged and used by the three, let's say, pillars of the EU leadership: the Parliament, the Commission, and the EU Council as well. So just to say a few examples, the European Parliament, when they published the resolution on the Sustainable Development Goals last June, have referenced our work on international spillovers. We've been working with the European Commission, including Eurostat, over the past couple of years to see how we can incorporate such metrics and multi-regional input-output tables, assessments into the annual reporting that the European Union is doing on the SDGs. And there's actually now, and I think we should commend Eurostat for doing this, there's an entire chapter related to those transboundary impacts and negative spillovers in the rest of the world in the annual reporting that the EU is doing on the SDGs. And then the EU Council is also very much aware of a lot of the work that we are doing on those issues. A final point to say that related to the European context, we will release on the 9th of December the European Sustainable Development Report, where we provide new metrics, but also extensive policy discussions and a narrative around how to address those spillover effects, but also more broadly how the EU can move forward in implementing these Sustainable Development Goals domestically, but also in terms of its international role and leadership on this agenda globally. It's time for me to close this webinar. Thank you so much, first of all, to our speakers and panelists today, Anousheh, Arunima, and Nina, for joining. Thank you also to all the participants that have an interest in the topic. Just to remind everyone that this study is available since this morning on the SDSN website, and that obviously we welcome any questions or comments. You should feel free to write to the SDSN, and we'll be happy to follow up with you. Thank you very much, and have a great